Welcome to Shooting Straight with AMF.com. I'm Frank Miniter, the editor-in-chief of the NRA's America's First Freedom. Today we have the great pleasure of speaking again with Stephen Halbrook. Now, he's an attorney who specializes in Second Amendment-related issues. He's an author. He's a contributor to America's First Freedom. In fact, our cover story for February is on his latest book called America's Rifle, The Case for the AR-15. Now, Steve, you're going to love this cover. Okay? Ruger sent us one of their AR-556 MPR rifles, which is, of course, all dressed up in the American flag. It's painted from the receiver down the barrel with the American flag. It's gorgeous. It makes the point. And we used your title on the cover, America's Rifle. And I know NRA members are going to get why it's America's Rifle, and most gun owners should. But what I'd like to start this, what I'm curious about, if you find yourself in mixed company somewhere, and someone asks what you do, you tell them, well, my latest book is America's Rifle, The Case for the AR-15, and you get a quizzical look. They're not sure what you're talking about. What would you say to them?
Well, if they're strangers or if they're people who I don't know what they think, I would probably be evasive at first. If it's in a professional setting, I would say, oh, America's Rifle, the book is about the Second Amendment protection for America's most popular rifle, the semi-automatic AR-15 type, of which there are many variations by many companies. If it's just somebody who I know casually, who strikes up a conversation on the airline, which I avoid anyway, I usually identify myself as practicing constitutional law. And in fact, that's quite accurate. I do a number of issues. I've done Fourth Amendment issues in the courts, and of course, First Amendment as well. So the way our society is, if it's just somebody that I'm, encountering randomly, I'm not going to get into a big discussion. But it's certainly, if it's at a professional meeting, I'm going to defend our position, to the total.
What if it's an agnostic and they've only read the media narrative on the AR, but they don't have a deep opinion on it. They don't realize that, of course, all rifles are used in less than 3% of murders, according to the FBI, in any given year. They don't know this data, and that the FBI, it's such a low percentage, doesn't even track the number of semi-automatic rifles that are used. But they just don't know that the AR-15 was first sold to the public in 1964, and it was 30 years before the 1994 so-called assault weapons ban that Americans have been buying these rifles, and more than 24 million available are owned by the public today. And so they just don't know much about this rifle. So they're agnostic, and they're looking at you with this quizzical look. What do you start to in order to deprogram them a little bit because of what the media too often tells them about this particular rifle platform, where do you begin there?
Well, first of all, this is the most popular rifle in America today. If you go to any typical shooting range, you'll see it being used by law-abiding people for lawful purposes, for shooting practice, target practice, competitions. It's widely kept for self-defense, and the media has given it a bad reputation. They use the term assault weapon. Assault weapon is just a propaganda term. It was made up by those who want to ban guns because they thought that if you have a semi-automatic rifle that looks a little bit like a military rifle, full auto M16, for example, then the public will be confused, and it makes it easier to advocate banning them. And you can have your media watermelon shoots and full auto, and they're not going to know the difference. So an assault weapon is a weapon used in an assault. You can use an umbrella or a broom or whatever in an assault. And in fact, if you look at a lot of judicial decisions, you'll see that term used for that very purpose, going way back in history. I think there was a 1940s case where the court said the assault weapon was a broom used by a prisoner. So an assault rifle came to mean a selective fire intermediate cartridge rifle used for military purposes, and it was basically invented by the Germans in World War II. It was called the Sturmgewehr, and that means assault weapon or assault rifle. And that term is correct. And in fact, assault rifle is used typically in military manuals, and it means a rifle that's selective fire. You can fire it on full auto, you can fire it on semi-auto, either one. But that's not what the semi-automatic AR-15 is. It's simply a ordinary rifle used by many millions of Americans.
I was surprised that the Associated Press recently changed the terminology, or they advised people not to use that fake term, political term, assault weapon, because it's just politically incites, well, it's ignorant. It's not what that rifle is. The semi-automatic firearm has been the most popular platform sold in America for a very long time. The AR-15 is just a part of that type of firearm. And I just don't think most people really grasp that, just how common the semi-automatic is, and you can't really differentiate that. So I wonder about conversations now with your new book, like as you're doing publicity on a mainstream radio show. I mean, what are they even asking you?
Well, just let me just go back a tiny bit on the use of the term. The term assault adds nothing to it. It's a semi-automatic rifle. I believe it's Oregon that recently passed a law defining a semi-automatic assault weapon or assault rifle as, and then they give the normal definition for semi-automatic, the definition that everybody agrees with. It's one shot per trigger pull, it's self-loading, and it's only one, as I said, one shot per trigger pull. But they take that definition that's in federal law and the laws of many states, and they say, well, that's the definition, not just a semi-automatic rifle, but a semi-automatic assault rifle. And again, it adds nothing. So in media interviews, typically we have to do some correcting, and we go into, as you mentioned, these rifles of any kind have a very low usage in crime. It's some of the spectacular crimes where they're used that get all the media attention. Sometimes they've been used, but in terms of overall statistics, that's a drop in the bucket. The most frequently used firearm in crime is a handgun. Supreme Court ruled in the D.C. versus Heller case that they're protected by the Second Amendment, and why would they not be? The Second Amendment protects the right of the people to keep and bear arms, and it looks at the issue from the point of view of law-abiding people, not criminals. Just because some criminals misuse some guns doesn't mean you can ban them, because then you obliterate the constitutional right.
Right, they're in common use, according to the Heller decision.
So the common use test really goes back to the 1939 U.S. versus Miller case, but Heller latched onto that language and formulated the test as if a firearm is in common use for lawful purposes by law-abiding people, it's protected by the Second Amendment. But Heller also had another rendition of that of the test, where it said if a type of arm is typically used by law-abiding people for lawful purposes, it's protected. That means that doesn't necessarily have to be in common use. I look at that as two different tests, both of which protect the arm in question. For example, in the Catano case by the Supreme Court, they said that electric weapons or stun guns are protected, and there's not that many that exist, but they're typically possessed for lawful purposes, for self-defense. And so you don't necessarily have to have millions and millions of the type of arm out there being possessed, but if they're typically used for lawful purposes, they're protected by the Second Amendment.
Right. In 1964, the NRA's magazine American Rifleman reviewed the new Colt at the time, new Colt AR-15 that was being sold popular to the public at the same time the M16 was just first being bought by branches of the U.S. Armed Forces. And they had a little bit of trouble with it. It was an interesting article to read looking back in time, because they didn't agree that the chambering 5.56 or 223 Remington was a heavy enough cartridge for the military to be using in battle. In fact, many hunters won't use it for big game. It's too light of a cartridge. But that's not how the media portrays that cartridge today.
Right. It's best used for small game in a hunting context, like prairie dogs or something smaller. Under the laws of many states, you cannot use that cartridge for hunting. I think the ballistics have gotten better, and some states allow it now. But
In the South,
in
they
terms
do
of
for deer, right?
um, you know, animals that are a nuisance, you can certainly use them for coyotes. Um, and it was very controversial when first adopted by the military. But the things you hear now, just like Joe Biden said, if you're somebody shot with a 9mm, it somehow obliterates you. There was actually a witness in one of the recent hearings from last year where a woman who was in the Marines, of all places, she made a similar comment about the 5.56 or 223 cartridge that was just totally unrealistic. So you get all of these myths, and they have to be refuted. What the book does, it goes into a lot of these myths at first, and the use of the propaganda term, and you can make it mean anything you want it to mean. And in fact, there's definitions that are totally opposite that some jurisdictions pass. For example, if you look at the state of New York, if a rifle has a conspicuously protruding pistol grip, then it's an assault weapon. And now the word rifle is defined in New York to include a shoulder stock. But if you go to Cook County and some of those Chicagoland jurisdictions, they define an assault weapon as a semi-auto rifle that has no shoulder stock. So, which one is it? And then if you go to Maryland, their generic ban doesn't even mention either one of those, either shoulder stock or lack of shoulder stock. So you just make it up as you go, and then the politicians can say that they did something. So the book goes into this array of mythology at first, and then we get into text and Supreme Court precedent. Of course, the text of the Second Amendment, the rifle is an arm. And the Supreme Court has said that if under the text, if it's a bearable arm, it's presumptively protected. And how can you show that it's not protected? Well, with any restriction, the court, and this is New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, said that if you can find founding era restrictions that were accepted generally in terms of restricting some rights, then there may be a legal basis for banning some practice, like guns in courts is an obvious example. I don't think many people would question the power of a state government to ban guns in court. Particularly, we have security in courts, we have bailiffs and marshals, we have protection, and we have in many courts metal detectors. So these are the so-called sensitive places. But if you can't find anything at the founding or shortly thereafter, like get out of here, it's not something that's a traditional restriction that's widely accepted. And what's going on in the litigation right now is the persons who are advocating for rifle bans and magazine bans are saying that, oh, well, Arkansas regulated or restricted the sale of Bowie knives in the antebellum era. Or Tennessee said you cannot carry a concealed pistol or concealed Bowie knife, things like that. It's like, get out of here. These are not analogs or analogies to what is being banned today. And they weren't even widespread. You won't find those laws about Bowie knives in most of the states. So that's what we have, how we present in the book in the initial stages. And then we go into a lot of history. If I can just go through some of that.
Please do. Yep.
English history is the beginning point for our history in terms of our Anglo-American jurisprudence, our constitutional history. And what we have, this is interesting. I've certainly been one to denounce kings. And I got that basically from our founders. We in America, we don't like kings. But on the other hand, if you look at Edward III, for example, he's well known today for the Statute of Northampton, which the antis argued means that you can ban the carrying of handguns, despite the Second Amendment says you have a right to bear arms. One other thing he did, though, Edward III, was passed a law requiring practice with the longbow on Sundays. And so you had the duty to bear arms to protect the kingdom. And what does this lead to? You have your bow in your home, you know how to use it, and you start thinking, I have a right to that bow. And so you have an evolution from the duty to bear arms to the right to bear arms. And I think if you look at English history, you had some resistance, like Henry VIII didn't like firearms at first because the longbow had been used so well to defeat the enemies of England. But it was a technology that couldn't be repressed, and those laws went by the wayside. And then we get up to the Declaration of Rights of 1689, which declared that Protestants may have arms, and that was one of the two individual rights in the English Bill of Rights, that and the right to petition. Speech wasn't even mentioned, by the way. So, and at that time, what were the arms? And the advocates, the supporters of the English Declaration of Rights had in mind muskets with bayonets and other scary arms like that. That it was the right of the Englishmen to have them. And when you look at what happened in the American colonies, every one of them required able-bodied males and sometimes households in general to have arms, and they were typically muskets of the same pattern that were used for military purposes. You had to carry arms to church. It might not be a musket, it might be a blunderbuss or a pistol, but that was basically required. You go back to Justice Kennedy's question back in the Heller case, and he asked counsel for D.C., well, didn't the founders need guns to protect themselves from criminals and Indians, and then my favorite part, grizzly bears? Because there were none east of the Mississippi. That said, that basically recounted or reinforced the idea that our arms can be required, and they certainly are a right. If you look at some of the Indian massacres, like at Jamestown in the early settlement, almost everybody was killed. After that, it was required to have arms, and that was the case in every colony. And then what happens when the screws start getting to be tightened? The British are doing one thing after another. They finally cut off navigation into Boston, and you have this escalation in the 1770s. And in Massachusetts, you have the reiteration of the requirement, like a reminder that you have to get your own arms and you have to keep them and be ready to use them in a certain amount of bullets and gunpowder. And so that's why one reason why we're able to, of course, win the revolution is because we had an armed populace. And then after that, of course, we have the Second Amendment to protect that right. And different states start coming into the Union, the early republic. And most of those states protected the right to keep and bear arms. And what kind of arms? How was the technology evolving? It was evolving into multi-shot revolvers. Actually, there were repeating flintlocks going back to the 1600s or maybe before. There was one exhibited in the mid-1700s in Massachusetts by an owner. And so you have the evolution of repeating arms, and finally, of course, you have the Henry rifle coming onto the scene in mid-19th century. And all this time, you continue to have new states coming into the Union, and almost all of them said, you have a right to arms. They weren't talking about flintlocks anymore. They were talking about the latest repeating arms. Why would you not want to have the best and most efficient arms? This comes up in litigation right now. Like, okay, well, 10 rounds is enough. Like, enough for what? What's common? What's a standard magazine capacity? Glock 17 or whatever. It's certainly more than 10. And your typical magazines for AR rifles they used to be 20, and now they're up to 30. So what I'm getting at is when you have this evolution of arms technology at the same time going on with new states and arms being protected in constitutions, that's what they were talking about. And as the court said in Heller, the Supreme Court said in Heller, the Second Amendment doesn't just protect arms that were in existence at the founding. Modern arms are protected just like modern printing presses are protected, or modern technology under which we exercise free speech. And so we get to the 20th century, we've got semi-automatic rifles are becoming widespread. Some of them have pistol grips. They have detachable magazines, and on we go. And there really was no restriction to speak of until 1989. But there were a few states that, because of prohibition, passed some restrictions on how many rounds a semi-automatic rifle could have. It was Michigan and Ohio and Rhode Island. And these were the states where illicit liquor was being smuggled. There was a lot of crime. So you have the government creating crime through prohibition, and then you have the government wanting to impose restrictions. And so the best example at the federal level, of course, was the National Firearms Act. The government created organized crime through prohibition, and then they wanted to do something about it, and they restricted law-abiding citizens instead. But these laws were repealed. They existed in only a few states. They're certainly not part of our history and tradition. We also have the phenomenon of repeating rifles being used by minority groups for self-protection, like the Winchester rifle. Ida Wells, the African-American writer, said that a Winchester rifle should be in the home of every African-American, and such rifles were used in incidents to prevent lynchings. So there's a long history of minority groups and oppressed peoples using these kinds of rifles. But that gets us up to the 20th century. Now, the Supreme Court is not looking at restrictions or practices from the 20th century to give it meaning to the Second Amendment. The meaning of the Second Amendment was fixed at the founding and shortly thereafter, when the understanding of the same people were still around. And there were a few restrictions on concealed weapons in a minority of states, things like that passed. But at any rate, through the 20th century, and some people might be surprised to hear me say this, Congress has mostly respected the Second Amendment in terms of bans. Of course, it passed the National Firearms Act, but if you go to 1968, there were no proposals to ban any kind of gun, and there were proposals to register guns, to require registration, and every one of those proposals was soundly defeated. So not only do we have a long tradition of Congress respecting mere possession of guns, they won't even allow registration, and we know that registration was prohibited in 1986, the Firearms Owners Protection Act, and then again in the Brady Act in 1993, and there's other ones since then. So we have the civilian marksmanship program being created in the early 20th century. And to this very day, that program still exists, and you can buy an M1 Garand rifle through that program, and you can compete with it. The government encourages rifle practice with military weapons. The three most important rifles that the CMP promotes use of would be the Garand, and then the M14 type, like the M1A semi-automatic by Springfield, or the M16 or equivalents like the AR-15. So once again, this is part of our tradition. And it was in the 1994 so-called assault weapon ban that Congress went astray. You have advocates for that ban denying that the Second Amendment protects any individual right. Of course, they were proven wrong then, but the Supreme Court has basically slapped them down since then in Heller, McDonald, and now Bruin. So that law, DOJ, Department of Justice studies showed that it didn't do anything to reduce crime. You have some people arguing that, well, crime went down after it passed. Yeah, it was going down anyway. And how could the passage of that law decrease crime when all the firearms that were banned under that law were grandfathered? So if you had what was called an assault weapon at the time of the law became effective in 1994, you still had it. And so there was no decrease in the quantity of these firearms. So, but they keep coming back wanting to do it. We've really only had, for a long time, 6 states passing these bans. California led the way in 1989. First, they banned a list of rifles by name, by model and manufacturer name. Then they came in and had some generic definitions to define a so-called assault weapon. My favorite one is the old conspicuously protruding pistol grip, which a California regulation defines as a weapon essentially that allows you to grasp the pistol grip. But it's compliant with that law if you're not able to grasp the pistol grip. So there's something called a fin device that you can use that makes it where you look like you're hitchhiking. So it makes your thumb go up. And when that happens, it's no longer banned. And think about the implications of that. So you're telling me this rifle is protected by the Second Amendment. If you can't hold it as good, you have to put your thumb up. But it's not protected if you can have a firmer grasp on it. And
right,
so
a good argument can be made they're less safe to shoot in California, New York, these compliant firearms. Absolutely.
Right. So there's been, right after Bruin came down, Delaware saw a need to ban these rifles. So they didn't get the memo. They didn't read the opinion, and they passed a ban. I think the governor signed it a week or two later after Bruin. Now Illinois is poised to pass something. So
New Jersey has as well, right?
Jersey passed it. I think it was 1990 or 91. Jersey was the first magazine banned state, and it was 15 was the limit at that time. It's since been changed to 10. And I litigated some of these early cases: California, New Jersey, New York, and those in California, the first Ninth Circuit case to deal with the issue said, well, the Second Amendment doesn't apply to the states. That was proven wrong later by McDonald. Mm-hmm. New York had said, the precedent said that the Second Amendment is not even individual rights, so we weren't even basically allowed to litigate the case under the Second Amendment. Same with New Jersey. They have no state constitutional rights to bear arms either.
Well, some lower courts have decided that the AR-15 air-type rifles, semi-automatic rifles, were not covered, and it said states could, like Maryland, could ban them. Now that we're post-Bruin, do you see those being overturned, or where's that going?
Oh, absolutely. So Colby is the Maryland case that upheld the ban. It was by the full Fourth Circuit en banc, it's called. So you had a bunch of judges agreeing that, well, you can ban these semi-automatic rifles because they're like full automatics. Like, where did you come from? Where did you get your knowledge of firearms, dude?
The Washington Post,
that's
I
such a
suppose,
basic
right?
distinction: full versus semi-auto. One round per trigger pull. Come on, and that's what they held. The court had judges, I think, who don't like the Second Amendment, and that's what they held. But there was a later case challenging the Maryland law again, and when the Supreme Court was deciding Bruin, it held that case. It didn't deny review of that case. It just held it for a while. And once Bruin came down, the Supreme Court sent that Maryland case back down to the lower courts to decide in light of the decision in Bruin. That's like a spanking. That's like saying that you got it wrong before. Why don't you get it right this time? Because Bruin says it's presumptively protected if it's a bearable arm, and they cannot find some kind of analog from the founding period where you could ban these ordinary guns. And another thing the Supreme Court did in Bruin, I love this, the lower courts had invented this test. Let me tell you, take a minute to tell you about its origin. When Heller came down, we filed suit against the District of Columbia because they passed this so-called assault weapon ban. And we thought all we had to do was to show that the rifles were in common use, because that's what Heller said. So the Court of Appeals, in a 2-to-1 opinion, agreed with us they're in common use. But then it made up this 2-part test where you go further and basically you weigh the government interest with the citizen interest, and of course the government always wins. And so in our 2-to-1 opinion, which we lost 2-to-1, that one dissent was Brett Kavanaugh, who was a judge on the D.C. Circuit at the time, and he would have overturned that ban. But then we come up to Bruin. I love Justice Thomas's statement of this. He said about the 2-part test, that's one part too many. You look at, is it a bearable arm? Is there an analog that would justify a restriction from the founding period? If not, that's where you stop. You don't go into this balancing test where the government always wins.
The Second Amendment, it's basically a restriction on government. That's what it is.
Yeah, it's not there for the government's convenience or for the government to basically emasculate. That's the whole purpose of a Bill of Rights. It's to let ordinary citizens know what their rights are, and so they can do what they need to defend them.
So now, Steve, you wrote this book, America's Rifle. Let me just ask you one last question here. Given you wrote this book and you've dug so deep into the history and so on, where do you see this going in the immediate future on this firearm platform?
So it's being litigated in the lower courts again. In the Ninth Circuit, for example, there's a couple of cases that one of which the district judge Benitez invalidated the law, California's ban. I think the Ninth Circuit 3-judge panel affirmed his decision, but then the en banc court, the Ninth Circuit has a rule that if there's ever a win for the Second Amendment, we're going to overturn it. And so I think there's been 50 cases there like that. But these cases are back in the lower court now, and so California is having to present evidence that they think about these analogs that would justify the bans. This is going on in New Jersey and in New York as well. So there's I don't know what these lower courts, what excuse they're going to find to try to say that these bans are consistent with the Supreme Court's Bruin opinion. But both the firearm and magazine bans are being litigated or relitigated, and we'll see what these courts do, whether they're true to the Bruin opinion.
This is an important time for the fight for this civil right. We need to keep our eye on that ball, on the NRA and so on. It's critical.
Yeah, I mean, since Bruin, it's hard to keep up with all these decisions. They're just coming out of everywhere, and good decisions too, out of New York, New Jersey, district court decisions, and validating the overzealous bans on claiming everywhere is a sensitive place and all of that. We've got some very good decisions, and we'll see where this heads.
So we need to keep, obviously, with America's Rifle, we need to keep getting the true word out especially on this important topic. How can people find your book?
Nowadays you can find a book online by any means necessary, like Amazon or Barnes and Noble. I don't know how many bookstores exist anymore or what bookstores might have it, but it's certainly readily available by mail order. When it first came out, it was actually number 1 on the civil law category in Amazon. So it's done well from the very beginning. It's very timely. I wrote the book with this whole issue in mind, and anticipating that hopefully the Supreme Court will take action in the cases it's been looking at, particularly Bruin, and it would have language that would be consistent with relitigating some of these lower court decisions. So it has been timely, and I think you'll find a lot of new material in it. This issue's been debated for a long time now, since 1989. But I think this is the first legal constitutional history type book on the issue of the AR-15.
Wonderful. Thank you, Steve.
My pleasure, Frank. Thank you for having me.